A golden retriever stands silently in the middle of a snowstorm, her three puppies trembling behind her. A car speeds away, taillights vanishing into the white void, but the dogs don't run. They just stare after it, waiting. Why did they just leave them there? And why are the dogs still waiting? Watch till the end. This story will change how you see hope. The wind howled low across the city's outskirts, tugging at signs, whispering down alleys, and sweeping over the cracked pavement of the old parking lot beside Eastridge Industrial Depot. Snow fell in thick, whispering sheets, blanketing everything in silence, save for the distant hum of traffic on Evermore's outer belt. Amidst the swirl of white, a single SUV, faded green, rust chewing its wheel wells, slowed as it rolled toward the far edge of the empty lot. The brake lights flared briefly, casting a red glow onto the snow behind. The vehicle came to a halt. The rear door creaked open. A golden retriever, her once glossy coat now clumped and dulled by cold and neglect, looked out. Her ribs showed through the tangled fur on her sides. Her eyes, brown, once lively, were wide with confusion and trust misplaced too many times. She was no more than 5 years old, but looked older under the weight of frost and fear. Behind her, 3 tiny figures huddled close. Puppies, barely old enough to walk. One had a stubby white patch on its forehead. Another, the smallest, shivered so violently its tiny tail thumped the metal floor. She turned toward the front seat, uncertain. No voice beckoned her forward. Instead, a foot kicked once against the interior wall, sharp, commanding. She jumped. Whining softly, the mother stepped down onto the snow. Her paws sank into the soft white as she turned to coax her pups. One by one, they stumbled out, tiny legs sinking into the drifts, pressing close to her sides. The wind cut through their thin fur. One of them yelped. That was when the SUV roared to life. The tires screeched, spinning slightly on the icy patch before biting down. Then the vehicle sped off into the snowstorm, leaving only swirling powder and the fading rumble of its engine. The mother stood frozen, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The puppies crowded beneath her. For a long moment, she simply stared after the red taillights. Then the lights were gone, and so was the only home she had ever known. Several blocks away, on the edge of Evermore's older suburban district, a porch light cast a warm but weak glow onto the front lawn of a small, weathered house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. A man stood just outside the front step, scraping snow from the walkway with a dull-edged shovel. The snowflakes collected in his graying beard and settled onto his worn denim coat. His name was Elijah Monroe, 48, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had spent most of his life working with his hands. His once dark hair had faded prematurely, streaked with gray, and his skin, though still strong, had the weary tautness of grief left unresolved. His eyes, deep-set, a piercing steel blue, were the kind that had learned to look through people rather than at them. He had the quiet bearing of a man who once loved deeply, lost even deeper, and never quite came back from the fall. Once, he had a family, a wife who painted sunflowers and a daughter named Ellie, who wore bright yellow boots, even on sunny days. That was before the accident on Interstate 83, 5 winters ago, that stole them both. Since then, Elijah had spoken more to engines than to people. He shoveled methodically, lost in his own storm of memory, when something caught his eye beyond the edge of his yard, movement, just a flicker, against the swirling white. He straightened, hand instinctively resting on the shovel's wooden handle. A golden shape emerged from the storm, low, slow-moving, then another, then 2 more. He narrowed his eyes. Dogs. He stepped forward, breath curling in the frigid air. The adult dog was leading 3 pups across the lot, limping slightly, ears twitching at each gust of wind. They were heading nowhere, just walking, wandering, looking back toward a direction from which no one would return. Elijah's breath hitched. His hand gripped the shovel until his knuckles whitened. He could hear his own heartbeat, deafening in the stillness. "Turn around, Monroe. Go inside." But he didn't. Because in that moment, he wasn't standing in Evermore anymore. He was back on the shoulder of I-83, headlights flashing against twisted metal, cradling Ellie's yellow boot in his hand while paramedics screamed his name. The snow around the dogs was piling higher. One of the puppies collapsed into the drift, its tiny body curling in on itself. "No," Elijah muttered. He dropped the shovel. At that very moment, across town at the Evermore Animal Aid Center, a young woman sat hunched in front of a flickering monitor. Mara Kwan, 23, petite and sharp-eyed, wore her dark hair tied in a loose knot under a beanie. Her layered clothes gave her a boyish silhouette, but her eyes, black and fierce with compassion, betrayed how much she cared about everything. She was known for challenging protocols, arguing with professors, and never walking past a stray animal without checking for a tag. Mara was in her final year at Ridgewater College's veterinary program. Evermore had been her hometown, but also her escape route from a family that expected law degrees and bank internships. Her soft spot for animals had begun when she was 12 and rescued a wounded barn cat during a thunderstorm, right before her parents divorced. That cat had slept beside her through every anxious night after. Now, her phone buzzed. A motion alert from the Department of Traffic's pilot camera program, a feed from a lot near Eastridge Industrial. She tapped it open. The video showed a beat-up SUV idling. Then the door opened. She leaned in, heart already sinking. Not again. She watched helpless as the dogs were pushed into the snow and the vehicle drove off. The timestamp was just minutes ago. Without hesitation, Mara grabbed her parka, phone, and medkit, yelling over her shoulder to the sleepy night shift receptionist, "Abandonment alert, Eastridge lot. I'll be back." Back in the storm, Elijah knelt beside the fallen puppy. It was still breathing, but barely. He scooped it up carefully, tucking it into the inside of his coat. The other two yelped in alarm, but didn't run. The mother growled low, but didn't bare her teeth. He met her eyes. They weren't just afraid, they were pleading. The door creaked open, groaning under the weight of the snow-packed wind that followed Elijah Monroe into the narrow hallway of his house. He carried the smallest pup beneath his coat, its body barely warm, and held the mother by an improvised leash fashioned from his belt. She moved hesitantly, her paws clicking softly on the tile floor, casting glances over her shoulder to ensure the other two pups followed. They did, but slowly. One limped, and the other trembled with each step, its breath misting rapidly in the cold air. The house was modest, worn with age and quietness. The living room smelled faintly of oil, leather, and old paper. A battered armchair sat near a stone fireplace, its hearth cold, unused. Boxes of unopened mail and yellowed books lined the floor by the coffee table. It was a home that hadn't known warmth in years, at least not the human kind. Elijah placed the shivering puppy onto a folded towel near the radiator, turned the dial up, and disappeared into the kitchen. The mother stood still for a moment, sniffing the air, her ribs showing more clearly now under the lamplight, her tail low but not tucked. He returned with a bowl of lukewarm water and half a can of tuna, the only thing remotely dog-appropriate in his pantry. She hesitated, then crept forward and ate slowly, warily, never breaking eye contact with him. He watched in silence. The smallest pup coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Elijah crouched beside it again, his fingers brushing its fur. It was damp and cold. The pup flinched at first, then leaned into his palm. Something old inside him shifted, like a hinge long rusted suddenly catching the wind again. "You don't have a name, do you?" he murmured. "None of you do." He glanced toward the mother. She had curled herself protectively around the other two, her eyes heavy with fatigue and frost, yet there was something luminous in them still, like a star barely burning in a long dead sky. "Lumi," he said aloud. "That's what I'll call you." The dog blinked slowly, and for a second, Elijah could swear she understood. He stood, sighing, and went to stoke the fireplace for the first time in almost 5 years. About 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Elijah stiffened, still holding the poker, the flames barely catching. He hadn't had a visitor in weeks, maybe months. He moved to the door, peered through the frosted peephole, and sighed. Outside stood a petite woman bundled in a navy parka, her black beanie dusted with snowflakes. She had round glasses and a messenger bag slung over one shoulder, with a stethoscope peeking from its side. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, observant and full of purpose. "Name's Mara Kwan," she said as soon as the door cracked open. "I'm from Evermore Animal Aid. Got a report from traffic cams near Eastridge Depot. Said a dog family got dumped. I traced the direction they went. Judging by the snow trail, I think they ended up here." She didn't smile, didn't shrink back when Elijah frowned at her. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, but had the confidence of someone who'd been underestimated before and learned to wear armor made of facts. "They're inside," Elijah said flatly, "but I'm not looking to hand them off." "That's not what I'm here for," Mara replied, stepping inside without waiting for a full invitation. She spotted the dogs curled by the radiator, and her face softened. "Oh God, she's just skin and bones." He closed the door behind her. Mara knelt beside Lumi, her gloved hands gentle, practiced. "3 pups. One looks sick, wheezing, shallow breathing. This one." She reached for the smallest. "We need to monitor this one. May need antibiotics. You've got heat going? That's good. Mind if I leave a few meds?" Elijah crossed his arms. "Are you going to report this?" "Already did," she said without looking up. "To my supervisor. It's protocol. Abandonment cases need documentation." "So this turns into another investigation where no one gets caught and the dogs end up in a shelter." Mara stood, brushing snow from her sleeves. "That doesn't always happen." "It happens enough." There was silence between them. She looked at him then, really looked, at the tight lines in his face, the weathered coat, the way his hand twitched slightly near his hip as if resisting the urge to reach for something that wasn't there. She recognized the grief in his posture, the kind that dogs knew how to heal before humans ever could. "You don't want anyone involved," she said finally, "because it feels easier to be left alone than let someone else disappoint you again. But that dog Lumi, right? She already chose you. You know that, don't you?" He didn't answer. Mara opened her bag, took out a small bottle, a dropper, and a handwritten sheet. 2 drops twice a day for the smallest one. "I'll come back tomorrow. I'm not trying to take them away, Miss Monroe." "Elijah Monroe," she nodded. "Okay, tomorrow then." She left without another word. Elijah stood at the door long after it had closed, listening to the wind. That night, as the dogs slept, Elijah found himself sitting on the floor beside them, back against the radiator, his legs stretched out. Lumi lifted her head once, then let it fall again onto her paws. The fire crackled softly. A creak echoed outside. He stood, moved toward the back window. The yard was coated in moonlit snow. A figure was bent down near the fence line, inspecting the ground. Not threatening, deliberate, slow. Elijah stepped out with his boots half-laced. "Carter?" he called. The figure straightened. Alfred Carter, 72, was his next-door neighbor and one of the last original homeowners on the block. He was tall, wiry, with a stooped back and a permanently curious look in his eyes. Once a U.S. forest ranger, Carter had spent his retirement tending a greenhouse and reading mystery novels aloud to his cat. "Evening," Carter said, brushing snow off his sleeves. "Didn't mean to spook you. Was just walking, and saw tire tracks out front." Elijah joined him by the edge of the property. The prints were clear, thick tread, deep grooves, and a sudden turn in the snow like the vehicle had skidded before speeding off. "Big truck," Carter muttered. "SUV probably. Same brand I saw last week near the park where someone dumped 2 huskies." "You think it's connected?" "I don't believe in coincidences," Carter replied. "I think someone's doing this on purpose, organized, systematic, could be more than just one case." Elijah said nothing. He stared at the snow, then back at the fading tracks. "You should report it," Carter added. "These people don't just stop." "Already got someone sniffing around," Elijah muttered. Carter chuckled. "The little one from the aid center?" Elijah nodded. "She's got fire in her. Reminds me of my wife when she worked rescue ops in Montana." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling dry branches overhead. "If anything happens," Carter said, "I'm right next door." Then he turned and vanished into the dark, his flashlight beam bouncing off the fences as he walked. Elijah looked back at the house. Inside, Lumi lifted her head from her pups and stared at the door. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a worn photograph of his daughter in her yellow boots. "Maybe it's time," he whispered, "to let something stay." The morning sunlight in Evermore was weak and pale, barely cutting through the gauzy cloud cover that blanketed the city in shades of dull silver. It reflected dimly through Elijah Monroe's kitchen window, glinting off the rim of a coffee cup he hadn't yet touched. His fingers traced absently along its edge, but his eyes were fixed on the object resting on the worn wooden table before him. Lumi's collar. He had removed it carefully the night before, after she finally settled with her pups by the fire. The collar was simple, a faded blue nylon strip with a rusting metal buckle, but the tag was what drew his attention now. At first glance, it looked like a standard, scratched identification disc. But now, under better light, Elijah could see something carved faintly into the underside. It wasn't a name or a number. It was a symbol, a circle, etched with precision, enclosing what looked like a stylized letter B, crossed with a vertical line. It was so faint it had nearly worn away. His brow furrowed as he ran a thumb over it. It wasn't something you'd find on a collar from a pet store. It looked custom-made, deliberate. Lumi padded softly into the kitchen, her tail brushing the floor. Her ribs were still visible beneath her softening coat, but her gait had improved. She nudged Elijah's leg gently, then glanced toward the living room, where the pups lay curled under a thick quilt he'd dug out from a storage trunk. All three were sleeping, or so he thought. A high-pitched yelp broke the stillness. Elijah was on his feet in an instant. The smallest puppy, he had begun to think of her as Little One, though he hadn't named her yet, was twitching violently, her tiny limbs jerking out of rhythm, mouth slightly open as if gasping. "Hey, no, stay with me," Elijah murmured, scooping her up and cradling her close. Her body was hot, but her shivers came in waves. Lumi whined, pacing in tight circles. Elijah's mind ran to the medicine Mara had left. He grabbed the dropper and administered 2 drops under the pup's tongue, just as instructed. But even as the tremor subsided, a chill climbed his spine that no heater could fight off. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just weakness or cold. It felt deeper, like something baked into her bones. Marquand arrived half an hour later, her bag swinging at her hip and dark circles under her eyes. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath visible in the morning air. "I couldn't sleep," she said without waiting for an invitation. "Kept thinking about that little one." She knelt beside Elijah on the floor, where he still held the puppy against his chest. Her fingers moved quickly and gently, checking pulse, temperature, pupil dilation. "It's not a seizure, not quite," she murmured, "but something's off neurologically. The medicine helped?" "A little," Elijah said, "but it keeps happening." Mara opened her bag and retrieved a small plastic vial and a swab. "I'm taking a saliva sample," she said, almost to herself. "We need to run this. I know a guy at the Ridgewater Veterinary Lab who owes me a favor. He'll expedite it." As she turned the collar over in her hand, her brow furrowed. "Wait a second. This symbol, you know it? I've seen it before, or something close. There have been stories. Scattered reports of abandoned Goldens across the region. All of them sick, all of them young. They found the same marking on some of the collars, but no one could trace it. It's not a brand or registry number. It's a signature," Elijah finished for her. Mara nodded. She took out her phone, tapped a few times, then handed it to him. "Look, it was an article from 2 years prior, archived in a vet student forum. A breeding facility called Brightkin Canine Genetics. Promised a revolution in temperament-engineered dogs. Shut down after only a year due to complaints, several lawsuits, and a whistleblower who alleged unethical practices and genetic manipulation." Elijah's mouth tightened. They were creating designer dogs, and throwing away the ones that didn't meet the specs, Mara said, her voice tight with disgust. "I thought it was just an urban legend." The puppy whimpered in his hands, and both of them fell silent. Later that evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows along the living room walls, Elijah sat alone at the table, flipping through a box of old newspapers and clippings. He had started keeping them years ago, first as a habit from his mechanic days, then as a means of distraction after the accident that took Ellie. He found one from a small county paper just over the state line. Illicit canine breeding under investigation after sick puppies discovered in National Forest. The photo showed a dog not unlike Lumi, tethered to a pine tree, half buried in snow. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. A knock sounded at the back door. It was Carter. The old man entered without waiting, wrapped in his threadbare coat and scarf. He held a photograph in a Ziploc bag, already fogged with condensation. "Thought you might want to see this," Carter said simply. The photo was aged, printed on matte paper, grainy but clear enough. It showed a dog, golden retriever mix, standing in a clearing deep in what looked like a forested ravine. She wore a similar collar, the same faint emblem. "Where is this from?" "Took it myself," Carter said, "back in 21, up in Copperfield Grove. I was helping the Wildlife Service track deer populations. She showed up out of nowhere, didn't belong to any of the locals, wouldn't come close, but stayed near our camp, always watching. Then one night she was gone. Same symbol, Elijah said. Same breed. Exactly, Carter said. And that's not the only one. Since then I've seen 4 more, different parts of the state. Always the same type of dog, always sick, always dumped in remote places. Why didn't you report it? I did, Carter replied, but no one wanted to connect the dots. Elijah placed the photograph beside the collar on the table. It was all starting to connect. That night, as snow began to fall again, Elijah stood by the front window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Lumi lay curled beside the fire, her pups pressed close. The smallest one stirred now and then, but had not seized again since the medicine. He picked up the collar, its worn nylon edges warm from his hands, and looked at the symbol once more. They weren't just dogs, they were evidence. Someone had gone to great lengths to create something unnatural, and even greater lengths to erase the failures. But they hadn't accounted for the people who still noticed, who still cared. Elijah turned away from the window. I'm not letting them vanish again, he whispered, and for the first time in years he felt purpose rise beneath the silence. The sky over Evermore remained a sheet of pale steel, snow continuing to drift from above in lazy spirals. Elijah Monroe sat on the floor of his living room, legs crossed beside the growing warmth of the fireplace. Lumi, now noticeably less gaunt and more trusting, lay stretched beside him, her head resting against his thigh. The pups were bundled in a repurposed laundry basket, lined with an old flannel shirt and a heating pad he'd scavenged from the attic. The house, which once echoed with absence, now hummed gently with life. It had been 5 days since the collar's mark was discovered. 5 days since Elijah had begun rising before the sun to prepare warm gruel for the pups. Since he'd bought proper bowls, constructed a small fenced area in the back shed, and reconnected the old space heater he used to think he'd never touch again. 5 days since he began speaking aloud in his home again. Not to ghosts, but to the dog who had quietly become a listener. He had found himself telling Lumi things no one else knew. About the accident. About Ellie's little yellow boots and the way she used to name every squirrel in the neighborhood. About Catherine, his wife, who painted birds on coffee mugs and had once called him the gruffest softy in town. Lumi didn't move, didn't whine. She simply watched him with those deep amber eyes, full of something that resembled understanding, an anchor in an ocean he hadn't known he was still adrift in. A soft knock broke the silence. He stood, and Lumi immediately rose to follow. He opened the door to find Mara Kwan, bundled tightly in a dark parka with fur trim, her cheeks flushed from wind, her hands clutching a satchel close to her chest. Her eyes, usually sharp and composed, looked tired, rimmed red, like she hadn't slept much. I have news, she said without preamble. Elijah stepped aside. Come in. Mara didn't sit. She stood near the fireplace, warming her fingers before she opened her bag and pulled out a folded printout. The sample came back this morning. The puppy, your little one, she's got something serious. It's neurological, likely tied to genetic manipulation. The test suggests she was bred for a specific trait, but something went wrong during the process. She's declining faster than we hoped. Elijah didn't speak, but his jaw tensed. Lumi walked over and nosed his palm. There's a specialist clinic in Chicago, Mara continued. They have a facility for experimental genetic damage. It's expensive, but they'll take her as a pro bono case because of the research implications. It's a shot. He looked toward the basket where the pup lay curled, breathing shallowly. You'd take her? He asked. Mara nodded. Tonight, if you'll let me. He turned back to the fireplace, silent for a long time. The weight of past losses pressed hard against his chest. Ellie had died in a hospital, too. He remembered how Catherine had clutched the stuffed animal Ellie had slept with every night, refusing to let go until the sun came up. I don't know if I can lose anything again, he said hoarsely. I don't think you'd be losing her, Mara replied. You'd be giving her a chance. He glanced at her then, truly seeing the strain on her face. You okay? She hesitated, then exhaled and sank onto the arm of the couch. No, not really. I uploaded a photo of the collar, just the marking, to the vet student forums and a few pro-rescue groups. Yesterday, I got an email with no name, just a message, Stop chasing things that don't concern you. Elijah's eyes darkened. You think someone's watching? I think someone doesn't want these dogs traced, she said. I think they're trying to erase the trail. She pulled out her phone, handed it to him. The message was plain, a single sentence. Beneath it, a file attachment had been blocked by her antivirus software. She hadn't opened it. Elijah handed it back. Do you still want to follow this? More than ever, she said, fire flickering behind her tired eyes. They shared a moment of quiet resolve. Outside, the wind picked up again, and the trees rustled like old bones. That evening, Elijah stood beside his truck while Mara loaded a small carrier into the back of her car. The puppy lay inside on a warm blanket, breathing lightly but steadily. Lumi whined softly as the door closed. Mara stepped forward. I'll call you when we get there. It's a 3-hour drive, but the team is ready. Elijah nodded. Before she got in, he placed something in her hand, a folded envelope. Just in case, he said. If there's anything she needs. She started to object, but stopped. She placed the envelope in her coat and squeezed his arm once before slipping behind the wheel. As the car pulled away, Elijah stood in the driveway long after its taillights disappeared, Lumi at his side. I'm not losing her, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone. Later that night, Mara stopped for gas outside Rockford. The station was quiet, snow swirling under the flickering yellow canopy lights. She filled the tank, then stepped inside for coffee. The cashier, a lanky man with shaggy blonde hair and a Bluetooth headset hanging around his neck, nodded silently as she entered. She passed a bulletin board on her way to the counter, and something caught her eye. A dog poster, not missing. Found, a golden retriever. The collar was blue. The poster was recent, dated 3 days ago. No contact name, just a phone number. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture, then ordered her coffee. As she left the building, she paused near the pumps. A black SUV was idling at the edge of the lot. Its windows were tinted, too dark to see through. It hadn't moved since she arrived. She felt the hairs on her neck stand up. Then it drove away, slowly. Her phone buzzed as she reached her car. A text from the Chicago clinic. We're ready for the intake. Drive safe, and thank you for not giving up. She looked back at the road ahead, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Neither are you, she murmured to the sleeping pup beside her. The wind howled against the windows like some ancient voice howling warnings in a language only the cold understood. The snow outside was falling hard now, thick, heavy flakes blanketing the quiet neighborhood in ghostly white. Elijah Monroe sat in the armchair he once considered ornamental, facing the fireplace that had become the heart of his home once again. Lumi was curled beside the hearth, the 2 remaining pups nestled between her front legs. She didn't sleep much anymore. Neither did Elijah. The smallest pup, now in Chicago under Mara's watch, had left a vacuum in the household, one that Elijah couldn't seem to fill no matter how many times he adjusted the heating pad or restacked the firewood. He stared into the fire, eyes heavy, but mind alert. Something in the air tonight felt off. Lumi's ears perked before he heard a thing. She stood, tense, moving toward the door with a low, guttural growl building in her chest. Her pups stirred but didn't move, sensing her unease. Elijah stood, reached for the coat hanging near the door, and stepped out onto the front porch. The snow crunched beneath his boots, muffled and soft. It was past midnight. The street, blanketed in white, was silent. Then he saw it. Just at the far end of the street, sitting still under the flickering glow of the broken street lamp, was a black SUV. Its engine was silent, its headlights off. The same boxy frame, same worn tires he remembered from the camera footage Mara had shown him days ago. It hadn't moved since he stepped outside. Elijah took a few steps forward, instinct bristling. His breath came out in visible plumes. Lumi pushed open the door behind him, staying low, her hackles raised. And then, without warning, the SUV's taillights flared. The vehicle reversed, turned, and glided away into the darkness. No screeching tires, no urgent getaway, just a quiet, deliberate disappearance into the snowy night. Elijah walked to the end of his drive and crouched, inspecting the tire tracks. Same deep treads, same size, the same slow roll exit, like whoever was behind the wheel wanted him to see, but not follow. He called the police. The officer who arrived was young, no more than 30. Officer Bradley Hunt, lean, clean-shaven, and too polite to be from Evermore originally. He had an eager voice and a nervous habit of tugging at the collar of his uniform. "So, you said it looked like the same vehicle from the earlier case?" he asked, scribbling something into a damp notebook. "I didn't just say it," Elijah replied, motioning toward the faint tire imprints already beginning to blur beneath fresh snowfall. "It was the same damn car, same shape, same build, same behavior." "Did you catch a plate number?" "No, no lights. It parked there just to watch." Hunt crouched, squinting at the snow. "Nothing to plaster a warrant to," he murmured, "but I'll log it." "You think this is some creep joyriding past my house in a snowstorm?" Elijah asked. "I think." Hunt stood, clearly uncomfortable. "That you might be caught in something bigger than what a town officer can wrap a case file around. I'll notify the station, but unless someone breaks a window or tosses a rock—" "They won't," Elijah interrupted. "They're too smart for that." "Who's they?" "That," Elijah said, nodding toward Lumi, "is what we're still figuring out." The next morning, Mara received a call she hadn't expected. A clipped voice on the other end, corporate, female, sterile. "We understand you've been reviewing case files tied to Brightkin," the woman said. "We'd like to invite you for clarification, as a professional courtesy." Mara hesitated. "Who is we?" "The legal advisory team representing former Brightkin assets. We're consolidating reports and would like transparency from all parties." It didn't feel like a trap. Not exactly. But it didn't feel clean either. 2 hours later, she arrived at the site where Brightkin once operated, an industrial facility on the edge of Foxford, surrounded by half-frozen brush and a chain-link fence now draped in for sale signs. The snow had muted everything. The building itself was gray brick, impersonal, with faded blue letters still barely legible on the upper facade, BK Gentech. Mara was met by Stella Nyers, the woman from the call. Stella stood in the lot wrapped in a heavy wool coat, hair pinned into a tight bun, face angular and sharp. Her heels weren't made for snow, and her gloves looked more like fashion statements than insulation. "Miss Kwan," Stella greeted, holding out a perfectly manicured hand. "Appreciate your cooperation. I'll keep this brief." They stepped inside. The interior was mostly cleared out, bare floors, unplugged computers, abandoned equipment. But as they reached a corridor sealed by a keypad door, Stella produced a keycard. "You're not with the police," Mara said. "No," Stella replied, smiling without warmth. "Which is why I'm still allowed access." The room beyond was cold and small, lined with what looked like old server racks and a wall of disconnected monitors. A central unit stood beneath the largest screen, powered down, dust-coated. "They didn't erase everything?" Mara asked. "They tried," Stella said, kneeling beside a console. "But someone copied footage from one of the older archives to a private system." She tapped in a command. The screen flickered. Grainy security footage appeared. A kennel room, rows of pens, dogs, most of them golden retrievers, some younger than others. One of them pressed against the camera-facing cage bars, her eyes familiar. Lumi. Mara's breath caught. "Timestamped 6 months ago," Stella said, "roughly 2 weeks before the facility was shuttered. That dog, your dog, was listed as L421. No name, no bio. Likely a genetic failure, slated for disposal." "And this was allowed?" Mara asked, voice rising. Stella didn't answer. She simply handed Mara a drive. "I was never here. You never saw this. You want to help the dog? That's your leverage. I suggest you use it before they decide to sanitize the rest." She turned and walked out. That evening, back in Evermore, Elijah stood at the window again, looking at the snow-covered street below. Lumi lay at his feet, unmoving but alert. The pup slept soundly nearby. His phone buzzed. It was Mara. "They tried to erase her," she said. "They failed." He said nothing, waiting. "I found footage. Lumi was one of theirs, and not just dumped, targeted. Her whole litter probably was." There was a long pause. "We're not dealing with random cruelty anymore," she continued. "We're dealing with something calculated." Elijah stared into the snow, heart pounding quietly. His hand found Lumi's head and gently stroked behind her ear. "They came back," he said. "Last night, parked on the street, just watching." Mara was silent for a moment. Then, "We're going to make them regret leaving her behind." Outside, the snow fell heavier, but this time Elijah didn't feel the weight of it alone. The surgical lights above the table burned bright and sterile, casting stark halos over gleaming metal instruments and the fragile, golden-furred body lying beneath a paper-thin blue blanket. Sunny, the smallest of Lumi's pups, barely more than a wisp of warmth against the steel, was surrounded by silent motion, gloved hands, whirring machines, and the steady beeping of monitors that measured the tremble of life hanging by a thread. Mara Kwan stood near the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her breath hitched each time the rhythm on the monitor jumped. She wasn't in scrubs today, just jeans, a gray hoodie under her down coat, and tired eyes behind fogged glasses. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Opposite her, bent over the table, stood Dr. Malcolm Elgin, a man in his early 50s with thin salt and pepper hair and a pair of surgical magnifiers strapped across his face like a headlamp. He was tall but stooped, with the lean build of someone who lived on caffeine and stress. His expression was one of quiet concentration, his fingers precise and calm. Dr. Elgin had been a leading figure in veterinary genetic medicine before retiring early from the corporate biotech world, disillusioned by what he called the Cold War of bloodlines. Now he operated a small specialty clinic on the outskirts of Chicago, one of the few places equipped to handle experimental neurological disorders in animals. Mara had pulled every string she could to bring Sunny here. "She's holding," he murmured without looking up. "But just barely. If this gene activation cascade doesn't stabilize." He didn't finish. Mara didn't need him to. Behind them, Elijah Monroe stood silently in the observation alcove, watching through the thick pane of tempered glass. His broad shoulders were rigid under his brown work coat. In one hand, he held a folded piece of paper, creased at the corners, edges soft from years of being reopened and reread. It was a letter from his daughter, Ellie, the last one she wrote before the accident. He had kept it in his wallet ever since. He didn't look at the paper now, just at the table, at Sunny, at what might be left of her if the procedure failed. Lumi's pup had gone from shivering in his coat to fighting for her life under an IV line and a laser scalpel. And Elijah couldn't do a damn thing but watch. In the waiting room, Mara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Carter, 2 attachments. Curious, she opened the message. 2 photos filled the screen. Both were scans, images of worn dog collars laid out on a wooden table, each one tagged with a paper note and a handwritten date. Some bore the same strange symbol from Lumi's collar, some had numbers, others bore new shapes. But the materials matched: nylon, reinforced leather, stainless steel buckles. Cheap, mass-produced, but all too intentional. She opened the second attachment. It was a spreadsheet, crude but organized. Each line item listed a tag ID, location found, breed, and health condition. One line jumped out. ID L421, breed golden retriever, location, Foxford, condition, neurological instability, status deemed unviable. That was Lumi. At the bottom of the document, Carter had added a single line in bold: cross-state patterns now confirmed. Abandonments span at least 4 states, suggest legal escalation. AC Mara's chest tightened. Earlier that morning, Carter had sat at his dining table, surrounded by documents, coffee-stained notebooks, and an ancient laptop with a cracked screen. His reading glasses perched low on his nose as he clicked through archived shelter logs and scanned handwritten case files he'd requested from state databases using his old Ranger credentials. Carter had always been a quiet man, but underneath the knitted cardigans and wry remarks was a mind trained to track patterns, in weather, in wildlife, and now in cruelty. He had spent the last 2 weeks comparing timestamps, terrain markers, and veterinary intake notes. One truth had emerged with clarity. This wasn't just a case of dogs being dumped. It was a coordinated disposal system, and it had fingerprints. Now it needed names. Back in Chicago, the operating room door hissed open. Mara looked up instantly. Dr. Elgin stepped out, peeling off his gloves. He removed his magnifiers and gave a slow exhale. "She made it through the worst," he said. "The spinal pressure's been reduced, and the abnormal growth near the cortex responded to the suppressants. She'll need intensive care for the next 72 hours, but she's stable." Mara sagged against the wall, the tension leaking out of her in one long breath. Elijah closed his eyes and bowed his head. He slipped the letter into his coat pocket without looking at it again. Elgin continued, "Whatever they did to her genetically, it's not just irresponsible, it's criminal. We found embedded markers, sequences that mimic neuroenhancement trials, but they were spliced with immune suppressors, which caused her system to attack itself. It's biotech Frankenstein work." Can you trace it? Mara asked. Elgin nodded. With lab access and tissue samples from other affected dogs, yes. You get me more like her, and I'll show you who made them. Elijah's voice, gravel and grief, broke the silence. We'll find them. Later, while Sonny lay sedated in recovery, Mara and Elijah sat outside under the awning of a nearby cafe, huddled in coats, sipping bitter hospital coffee from cardboard cups. Snow fell lightly now, almost gentle. Do you think she'll walk? Elijah asked. Mara looked down at her cup. She might, but even if she doesn't, she'll live. That matters more. He nodded, quiet for a moment. You're building a case. Yes, with Dr. Elgin's data, Carter's records, and that footage from the old Brightkin cameras, we can expose this. I've already spoken with a legal nonprofit. They're assembling a team. If we can connect the dogs across state lines, we can charge them federally. And you're not afraid they'll come for you? She smiled faintly. They already did. That SUV by your house wasn't random. You still want to fight? Mara leaned back, watching flakes settle on her lap. I think fighting is the only thing that feels right now. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence shared between people who had seen death and refused to surrender to it. Then Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. He unfolded it and handed it to her. She read it slowly, quietly. Ellie's handwriting was childlike but firm. Dear Dad, I know you don't always believe in luck, but I think luck is just love showing up in disguise. So if something finds you one day, even if it looks lost or broken, maybe that's just love, trying to come home. Mara looked up, blinking fast. She was brave. She was everything, Elijah whispered. And now, somewhere in the recovery wing, the dog who almost never had a name was breathing, resting, and waiting for love to come home. The press conference was held in a modest auditorium inside the Evermore Civic Center, a building once used for school band recitals and winter charity drives, now swarmed with local journalists, legal representatives, and a few unshakable animal welfare volunteers, whose eyes carried the hard glint of righteous fury. At the front of the room, behind a long table draped in navy cloth, sat a small panel of speakers. Mara Kwan sat second from the left. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled from the drive, and a single loose strand of hair had fallen across her brow, but she didn't move to fix it. Her fingers clutched a printed dossier in her lap. To her left sat Dr. Malcolm Elgin, still in his lab coat, despite Mara's suggestion that a sweater might humanize him. He had refused. Science was his shield. To her right sat Rachel Medina, a sharp-eyed lawyer from the nonprofit legal collective Voice for the Voiceless, who had joined the case after seeing a viral video Mara hadn't known would spread like wildfire. That video had been recorded by Elijah's dashboard cam. 3 nights earlier, Elijah had been sitting at his kitchen table, flipping through archived folders on his laptop. He had installed the cam years ago when he still worked long-haul gigs across state lines, and it had never once recorded anything of interest. Until now. He found it buried in a labeled folder. December 9th front cam. The file was grainy, the snow thick, but it was there. The moment. A black SUV idling at the edge of a frosted parking lot. The rear door opening, Lumi stepping out, glancing back, and the most haunting image, 3 tiny golden pups huddling close as the SUV pulled away without hesitation. But it was what happened next that gripped the nation. The dogs, confused and scared, didn't run. Instead, they stood there, motionless, staring into the white void, watching the vehicle disappear. They waited. The kind of waiting that made your chest hurt, as if they believed, even as they were abandoned, that someone might change their mind. Elijah hadn't added music. He hadn't cut or edited anything. He uploaded it just as it was, with a one-line caption. They still believed someone was coming back. In less than 48 hours, the video had over 1 million views. Now at the podium, Mara adjusted the microphone. 2 months ago, she began, voice steady. A litter of genetically altered golden retrievers was abandoned in a snowstorm on the edge of Evermore. 1 pup was near death. Another displayed signs of cognitive impairment. All of them wore collars bearing unregistered markings linked to Brightkin Gentech, a facility supposedly shut down last year. She looked at the crowd. Flashes popped, pens scratched. We have secured tissue samples from 3 affected dogs, all with matching DNA sequences containing illegal markers consistent with experimental genetic splicing. Dr. Elgin will explain further. Elgin stepped up, adjusting his glasses. In short, he said, these dogs were created, not bred, designed for a temperament and aesthetic profile, then discarded when the results proved defective. He held up a laminated printout of a double helix sequence, certain segments marked in red. This, he continued, was done using restricted techniques outlawed in 2019 due to ethical violations and fatal outcomes in test animals. We've traced the procedures to Brightkin's lab equipment, now in storage but unaccounted for. It's our belief these techniques were used long after the company's closure. Then Rachel Medina took the mic. We filed a formal complaint to open a federal investigation against Brightkin's CEO, Gregory Thorne, she said. Evidence links Thorne to off-the-books operations continuing through proxy locations in 4 states. We're pursuing civil charges for cruelty, unauthorized animal testing, and conspiracy to destroy evidence. She paused. But more than that, we're here because a man decided not to look away. She turned toward the back of the room. Elijah stood in the shadows behind the last row, his presence quiet, unannounced. Lumi was beside him, calm and alert. She wore a new collar, blue, but now with a tag that read simply, Murphy, family. Sunny's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. She was still weak, but no longer fading. Her eyes had regained their shine, and the tremors had almost ceased completely. Mara visited every day, whispering softly into her ear, brushing her fur, adjusting her IV line like a seasoned vet tech. But it was the morning Sunny first lifted her head, blinked toward the doorway, and wagged her tail at the sound of Mara's voice that everything changed. Mara cried, fully, uncontrollably. Not from exhaustion, not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief. Hope. Proof that love, when stubborn enough, can reach the places science can't. Elijah was the first to say it out loud. I want to adopt them, all 4. He said it to Mara one evening outside the clinic, the Chicago skyline behind them and Lumi pressed against his leg. They've been through hell. They don't need new homes. They need a home. One. A steady one. Mara had smiled with wet eyes and said simply, they already have one. That same week, Carter had compiled his final spreadsheet. He brought it to Mara himself, printed and annotated, bound with a rubber band. He'd highlighted the patterns, the regional loops, the abandonment sites, the false adoptions from breeder databases. He had even attached Polaroids, all taken by him. One was particularly damning, a photograph of a white van, license plate blurred by snow, parked outside a known drop site. The dog in the foreground had a green collar with the same hidden mark Elijah first discovered on Lumi. They thought no one was watching, Carter said quietly, but I've been watching all along. He handed her a flash drive. Here's the full list. 43 dogs, 9 with partial survival, all golden, all dumped. Mara took it with both hands, her grip firm. We're going to make this matter, she said. As the press conference ended and the lights began to dim, journalists gathered their gear. But before leaving, several stopped by Mara's table, offering nods, quiet thanks, even a hand on her shoulder. She accepted them all with humility, but her eyes remained on the crowd. Rachel leaned close. It's starting, you know. What is? The wave. And she was right. Within hours, the video reappeared on news stations. Activists flooded forums, offering donations, organizing protests, demanding reform in animal experimentation law. Photos of Lumi and Sunny, now nicknamed the Blizzard survivors, began circulating as emblems of resilience. And through it all, Elijah kept mostly to himself. He returned to Evermore, repaired his fence, built a larger enclosure in the backyard, hung a wind chime by the porch. Sunny's carrier sat just inside the front door, still padded in Mara's flannel blanket. The pups played clumsily across the living room floor. Lumi followed him room to room, never far behind. One night, as snow began falling again outside, he stood by the window and whispered to the quiet house, "This time, they're staying." And for once, there was no voice to contradict him, only the echo of little paws across warm wooden floors. The house on Alder Street no longer looked forgotten. Once hidden behind an overgrown hedge and chipping white paint, it now stood open and warm, the yard trimmed neatly with a modest wooden sign hammered into the soil by the gate. The lettering was hand-carved, slightly uneven, but unmistakably sincere. Murphy House, Safe Paws Sanctuary. 6 months had passed since the press conference. 6 months since Elijah Monroe had stood at a podium in borrowed slacks and told the world he wasn't a hero, just a man who couldn't ignore a pair of trembling eyes in the snow. And in those 6 months, everything changed. What began as one broken family of dogs had grown into a quiet network of healing. Every morning, Elijah woke at sunrise, opened the back gate, and released a blur of paws and wagging tails into the sunshine. Lumi, sleek and golden now, her ribs no longer visible, always trotted out first, taking her role as guardian seriously. Her pups, clumsier and louder by the day, tumbled after her across the grass, and among them was Sunny. She had grown slowly at first, uncertain on her legs, prone to exhaustion. But day by day she regained strength. Her walk had a slight limp, and her vision wasn't perfect, but she ran now, ran like she had something worth chasing. Around her neck fluttered a red knitted scarf, slightly frayed at the ends, the edges uneven where the stitches changed direction. Mara had made it herself, staying up long after vet clinic shifts, determined to finish before Sunny's discharge. It had taken her 3 tries and 2 online tutorials, but it held. Sunny never took it off. Mara visited often, but these days she came in her official capacity, now the lead veterinary technician at Evermore Pet Recovery Center, a community clinic that had been on the verge of closing before the Brightkin case thrust their city into the national spotlight. She had turned down 2 offers from larger hospitals. She belonged here. Her usual uniform was practical. Olive scrubs, hair pulled into a tight ponytail, pockets always filled with syringes, chew treats, and folded papers. But her eyes were softer now, and she laughed more, an easy, quiet laugh that made dogs wag their tails without knowing why. She arrived that morning with a new intake. Pickles, a wiry terrier mix who looked perpetually skeptical of everything around him. Half his face was white, the other caramel brown, and his ears stuck up like someone had glued them in place. He barked at everything, birds, clouds, his own tail. Elijah met her at the gate. "Another one?" he asked, smiling as she passed over the leash. "Found behind a bakery dumpster. Still smells like cinnamon rolls," she replied, chuckling. "I'll put him near the porch. Lumi will handle the rest." She always does. Inside, Carter sat in the sunroom, which Elijah had converted into a reading nook and file space for the retired ranger. A new bookshelf had been installed against the wall, filled with binders, photo albums, and labeled folders. A small hand-painted plaque above it read, "The Archive, curated by A.C." Carter wore his usual navy cardigan, patched at the elbows, and wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up from his notes as Mara entered. "You're late," he grunted playfully. "I've logged 2 more golden cases from out of state, South Dakota and Missouri. Same collar design." Mara sank onto the bench opposite him. "You're supposed to be retired." "I am retired," he muttered. "I'm just not idle." He handed her a photo, an image of a scarred golden retriever pup sleeping in a crate, a tag with a now familiar symbol beside it. "Still think we've seen the last of them?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "Not even close, but now we know what to look for, and people are paying attention." From the kitchen, Elijah called out, "Coffee's hot!" Mara grinned and stood. "Still brewing it like engine oil?" "Stronger than your stitches," he fired back. In the backyard, Lumi lay in the grass, eyes half closed, watching her pups chase each other around the rusted garden gnome Elijah never got around to removing. Sunny rolled in the grass nearby, her red scarf slightly crooked after a particularly vigorous tumble. One of the pups, now nearly full-grown, leapt up onto the porch and barked twice. Elijah stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. All right," he said. "Dinner's coming." The dogs barked in approval. He looked over the scene, the bright sky above, the dirt under his boots, the laughter from Mara in the kitchen as she and Carter debated something over a crossword. He watched Sunny nudge her sibling to play, Lumi resting near the flower bed she had claimed as her spot, Pickles barking at a bee as if it were a personal insult. And for the first time in many, many years, Elijah felt it. Not just peace, but the sense that life, messy and unexpected as it was, had chosen to circle back, that something, someone, had been guiding things home. He walked down the steps, sat on the porch beside Lumi, and ran a hand over her head. She pressed into his touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating in her chest. "I used to think no one came back," he whispered. "Not after the snow." He looked across the yard, eyes misty, then up toward the sky where the clouds had begun to part, letting golden rays fall across the grass. "Thank you." he said softly, "for choosing this house, all of you." He reached into his coat and pulled out the weathered letter from Ellie. The corners had yellowed, the ink was fading. He unfolded it one last time and read the final lines aloud. "Maybe luck is just love showing up in disguise. So if something finds you one day, even if it looks lost or broken, maybe that's just love, trying to come home." Elijah looked down at Sunny, who was now resting with her head on Lumi's flank. "I think it found me," he said. And in the warmth of that sun-drenched yard, surrounded by four-legged souls who had once known nothing but cold, it was easy to believe that some families aren't made by blood or by planning, but by rescue, by persistence, and by the quiet hope that even after the worst winters, something might still come home. Sometimes love doesn't knock at our door. Sometimes it shivers in the snow, waits by the roadside, or hides behind frightened eyes. And just maybe, that moment when you decide not to look away, that's when God works his quietest miracle. In a world that often feels cold, unpredictable, and unjust, Echoes in the Snow reminds us that miracles don't always come as lightning or fire. Sometimes they come on four legs, wrapped in golden fur, with eyes that still believe in good, even after being left behind. When Elijah opened his door that night, he wasn't rescuing a dog. He was welcoming home the broken parts of his own heart. And through that act, God gave him back something he'd lost long ago: purpose, peace, family. So if you've ever doubted whether your small act of kindness matters, if you've ever wondered whether love can still find you, even when you feel forgotten, let this story be your answer. If this touched your heart, leave a prayer in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe for more stories of redemption, healing, and the quiet miracles God places in our paths. And may God bless you and every soul who still believes in second chances.